Ableton has so many different types of audio effects, and a lot of them are underrated. So today I'm going to attempt to cover all 44 in one video. Now there's going to be a lot of information in this video, as you can see by the length. So if you want to learn all about the inner workings of Ableton at your own pace, I'd also highly recommend while you're here that you grab our free Ableton Workflow Bible, which is going to set you up for a win every time you're making music in the DAW. But we've got a lot of ground to cover today, so let's get straight into it. Okay, so we're going to start with the delay and loop devices, beginning with beat repeat. Now, if you like glitchy music, this is your device. What it does is it takes incoming audio and either layers on top or replaces it with different rhythmic slices. Here's the original. And here's with beat repeat on. Even though there's a lot of confusing controls on this device, there's a few key ones that you need to know. Interval determines how often it listens for new audio. At the moment, I've got it set to 1 bar, so it will take a new snippet of audio every 1 bar. The grid determines the length of those chops. The smaller you get, the glitchier it is. The gate here determines how long the repeats will start for. So for example, at 1 bar, it'll be consistently bringing in new chops based on the length of the grid here. But if I bring this down, you'll see it won't actually glitch and repeat the whole time. Helpful if you want to add some of the original signal back in there. I like to leave the channels on 100% because that keeps it being not random. You can also add some cool pitch effects. The pitch decay over time changes it over time. Offset shifts the interval start point by a rhythmic interval. You can add a decay to create volume fades. And then you can mix the output mode, which either mixes the original signal with the looped one like I've got it on now, or it replaces it, or this is the repetitions only. You got a filter to control it as well, and that's it. So delay is an absolute must if you're an Ableton user. Previously, they had multiple different device types that have now all been combined into one, so you can pretty much use it for 90% of your delay needs. Now, if you don't know how delay works, Luke has got a separate video which I'll link here up in the top corner, so you can check that out if you want. But how this delay works is you've got different sync modes for the timing. You can either sync it to the BPM or have it freeform, and these knobs control it. You can unlink them, and with the sync mode, choose the different rhythmic intervals. These are all divided by 16th notes, so for example, 4 is 4/16. 3 is 3/16. You control the length and the amount of delays that happen after the original signal with the feedback knob. So more feedback is more louder, longer repeats. This infinity knob freezes it, making it like an endless loop. The main control here is the filter, and this really shapes the sound of the delay in different ways. I like to use this visual control here to control the exact frequency and width of the delay sound. So for example, a thinner one will sound like this, whereas a thicker one will sound like this. And if you don't want the filter, you can just disable it. There's also some really cool modulation in the newer device, which you can use to add this cool pitch modulation or different types of modulation depending on the modes here, which I'll get to in a second. You can set the LFO rate here, and you can modulate both the filter sweep here or the time, which is this time over here. And so if we can hear both of those. And time. Really, really cool. And then you've got different modes here. So repitch with the time adjustments will repitch the new delay by actually slowing it down or speeding it up, which sounds like an old school tape machine. You've also got fade, which will crossfade the old timing with the new timing. And then jump just cuts straight between the times. And then lastly, you've got ping pong, which will balance the delay between left and right. Great for stereo width. And then you control it all with your classic dry wet. Super simple yet super powerful delay device. I use this on like every track. Now Echo is like delay on steroids in my opinion. And to show you the differences, I've loaded up the same ePiano preset with the same MIDI down an octave, just to show you how this has slight differences in sound quality. I actually personally love using the presets on the Echo device here, but I want to show you how I can really dive into the nitty gritty. For example, you'll notice by default, it just has a more natural sound to it. This is based off the analog qualities of this device. It's modeled off analog delays, not digital ones. For example, the Roland Space Echo. And the way you get the sound to be different out of this is by using the feedback and input settings here. For example, I can really drive the input of the delay. I can compensate by bringing the dry wet down a bit, but you'll get a much crunchier kind of sounding delay. You can also change the output here to control any loudness changes. You can also clip the input and invert the feedback, which is not something I do very often. It only works with short delays. But you've also got a few other cool timing differences. For example, the timing settings are very similar, but different between the delay device and the echo device. You can choose notes, triplets, dotted or 16th intervals, and then control the amount based on these left and right. Again, having the option to unlink them if you prefer adding different left and right delays. The visual there is really cool. Offsets for each side, so you can get some really, really cool, like, again, drifting type delays, which adds this thickness and character. We've got a much more nuanced filter control where you can actually change each of the two bands individually. As I said, reverb, you can change where it happens, pre or post the delay, the decay of the reverb. You've got the stereo width control here to control how wide the delay feels. You can do ping pong mode or mid-side mode, which is, again, is something different between the other delay device. It does not have this, so you can have a middle and a side delay and alternate between those two. And then, unlike the other delay device, you've got a much richer set of modulation and character controls here. For example, you can add the modulation to the delay and filter like you were on the delay device. However, you've got this ×4 knob here, which can actually basically increase the modulation amount by a lot. You can change the type of shape it is. That's sick. And then you've got these character controls, which basically gate and ducking, respectively. Gate actually mutes the wet signal when it goes above this threshold, and then ducking just kind of massages it but doesn't completely get rid of it, kind of like a compressor, which is great if you're wanting to add these cool dry, wet sucking effects. And then you've got noise and wobble, which can add a bit of pitch instability. I'm just going to turn off this modulation for now so you can actually hear the noise and the wobble. These morph amounts just change the shape and type of noise and wobble so you can get different characteristics. And obviously the amount controls the amount of the effect there. Very powerful, but really, really good to use. It's great for trippy guitars, wobbly leads, and just generally ethereal sound design. So filter delay is one of those underrated but really powerful devices that I don't use a lot, but every time I do, it's for a very specific cool sound design purpose. Now, to show you this effect, I've loaded up a vocal one-shot, and I'll just show you what it sounds like. And I've enabled filter delay now, and what it does is it uses 3, that's how you do 3, different delays, one pan to the left, one in the center, and one to the right. And using different settings for each of those delays creates a really cool space to put different sounds in. It creates different rhythmic effects that sound really good in the mix when you blend it with other instruments and sounds. And so the really cool thing with this delay is you can actually use a combination of both time synced and BPM synced delays. So you got left one being 165 milliseconds, the center one being 2/16, which is synced to the BPM, and then the right one being 219. So you're getting the left and right be slightly different. They've got slightly different feedbacks. And then you've got this more central one, which is a more stable rhythm. So we get this degree and this marrying of randomness and chaos with this ordered delay in the center, which I absolutely love. You can pan each of these delays slightly differently. For example, the left and right ones don't have to be hard left and right. You can bring them more towards the center. You can change the volumes of the different delays, and then, filters of different delays like we showed on the delay device, and then blend it all with a dry knob that just controls the level of the dry signal there. Really specific, but really powerful device. I love to just mess around. Really sick. Now, grain delay is less of a standard delay, but there is some similarities. What it does is it takes the audio incoming and it chops it up into tiny, tiny grains, processes them and arranges them in different ways, and then blends it with the dry wet signal. So here's a Rhodes chord that I've got loaded up dry. And now here it is with some grain delay with some settings tweaked that I've already put on. Really cool effect, right? And so if we look at the layout of the grain delay here in Ableton, there's a few standard controls we can see. Now, bear in mind, there is these different selection options on the X and Y grid here. Basically, what this allows you to do is control any two parameters with this XY pad. I tend to not use this, but you're welcome to if you like. So we've got our standard dry, wet, feedback, and time settings, but we've got these 4 controls at the top that are different, which is spray, frequency, pitch, and random pitch. Let's start with spray, which basically determines the randomness of the grains that are created. So it kind of blurs them and kind of buzzes them around and moves them around so it's not a consistent sound. Frequency basically determines the size of the grain, and basically longer grains are created by smaller frequencies. The higher the frequency, the more granular it will sound. And then if you notice, if we mess around with this spray, the sound just becomes a bit more blurry. The pitch here, what it does is it actually, with each feedback, pitches up the grains an octave if it's set to 12, or whatever pitch value is set here. So I could go down 12, for example. Or I could just, leave it to normal and it will just be normal pitch. And then random pitch adds a little bit of a tiny pitch offset with each repeat. Again, adding some thickness to the layer. I could turn it completely down if I wanted a very consistent sound. But I could add it more if I wanted it to be more, nebulous and random. Kind of sounds quite lo-fi there. And you can basically use this combination of effects to create these really cool, grainy, atmospheric beds of sound. Now, Looper is predominantly a live performance tool, but I'm going to give you a brief overview just so you can use it in your productions as well if you want to. Basically, what it does is as you play any sort of audio, you can hit record while playing that audio, and it will basically take in a certain amount of audio, and then once you hit the button again, it will then layer that over the top. This allows you to basically, if you're recording instruments, record multiple takes over the top of each other, creating a nice textured, layered sound. So if I keep playing this and hit record and then stop, it's going to loop, but also with this overdub, which is this plus here, it's going to keep doing that based on how many bars in length the distance was from when I started recording and ended recording. So Looper has guessed it to be 1 bar. So every bar now it's going to be taking in new audio, adding that over the top and basically layering it. And it's just going to keep doing that until I then press this play button, which means it will just leave the audio as it is. It will stop there and it will just keep playing. And then, of course, I have the option of pressing it on and off again, adding new layers in where I'm not. And this button is actually optimized for a foot pedal. You can look at the different controls on the bottom left of the screen there. In Ableton, it will tell you exactly what it does. There's a few other cool controls you can do on this though, which I like for creative sound design. For example, you can change the speed of the different loops so you can get this nice pitched up effect. And reverse it. You can also change the feedback of the incoming audio so it's not played at the same volume as the original audio, which is good if you're adding lots of layers, which can very easily get very loud. So Spectral Time is an insanely fun newer device that Ableton have brought out in the last couple of years. I'm just going to play this example and you'll hear for yourself. Sound design possibilities are endless with this thing. And how it works is you've got 2 different parts to the Spectral Time device. You've got the freezer and the delay. Now, what the freezer does is it takes different moments of the audio, depending on the settings you've got here. So I've got it set to re-trigger based on onsets, which basically senses the parts of the audio where it thinks it wants to grab new frozen parts from. And it will basically say, hey, this chop, I'm going to repeat. And then you've also got this sync option, which will basically take a new chop every interval. You can, again, have it set to a rhythmic interval or a free-form time-synced interval. Or you can also manually automate it by pressing manual, and you can use this freeze button here and automate the freeze button there. I like to use onsets though, because it's kind of random. Once you've chosen which parts of the audio you're going to freeze with this section, you can then move on to the delay, which kind of acts like a normal delay effect, but with a twist. You've got a few common effects like time, which is how long the delay is, the feedback, but then you've also got the shift, which will actually shift the frequency of the delayed signal using frequency shifting, which is an effect that Ableton also have. I'll be getting into that later. It kind of adds this really cool like pitch effect. And then this tilt, spray, and mask also furthermore characterizes the sound of the time. I'm not going to go into the exact specifics of what each of these do, but just have fun and go nuts with them. It's literally insane. You can control the amount of stereo image, the mix of this effect from just the standard frozen grains. Just bear in mind, this differs from the overall dry wet, which actually blends the whole effect with the dry signal. You've got this resolution control. I like to use Ultra because it sounds the best. You can change the input, and then you can also change the routing, whether you want to do the delay first, then freeze, or freeze, then delay. And so I think this is just a really good device to have fun with. Don't think about it too much. Try to play around with a few of the presets and see what cool time stretching effects you can come up with. Chuck it in the background of your song, create cool atmospheres. Okay, let's move on to the drive and color effects. And we're going to first dive into the amp device. Now, this is one of my favorite distortion units in Ableton. It obviously sounds amazing on guitars and that kind of thing, but it also sounds amazing on synths and other instruments. If we look at the display of this here, and I've just got a synth pad loaded up for the example. I'm just going to play it without any amp. Pretty clean analog sounding synth with amp on though. We get life, grit, and bite to the sound. So I really love this to add color to leads and basses. The main characteristic here that you can choose between is the amp model, or amp type as Ableton calls it. Heavy is what I'm using for this sound, but you've also got clean, boost, blues, rock, lead, bass, and then heavy again. And the amount of character that these models add to the sound depends on the gain that you're driving in. Now, if you're adding gain, you also want to compensate with the volume at the end by decreasing it because it may get too loud. You've got bass, middle, and treble controls, which basically EQ the sound of the amp. So if you want to take some of the high end out, you can do that. And the presence is also an additional tonal control for that upper frequency range. It just helps to make it a little less crispy or a little less bitey. So if you're finding the sound is just too nasally, I like to bring this down as well. You can set it to mono mode or dual mode. Just know that mono mode removes any stereo image. And then you can also just dry wet it with the original signal, which is an option if you want to bring some of that unprocessed signal back in. Now, I like to go one step further and use the cabinet device, which is obviously designed to be used in conjunction with the amp because, hey, it mimics a guitar cabinet and a guitar amp. Together, they sound great. However, you can use the cabinet on its own as a kind of cool muffling effect, but what we're going to do here is use it just to control the sound of the amp. Now, the way it works is you've got the speaker size. Now, this is 1 times 1 12-inch driver, 2 times 2 12-inch speakers, 4 times 12-inch speakers, 4 times 10, and then a bass guitar cabinet at the bottom there. These just all have different characteristics. Play around with the one that you like best. I liked 4x10. You can change the microphone position. Obviously, this is a fake microphone. Near on axis is the cleanest sounding, but if you want to get some more muffled effects, try near off axis or far if you want to add a bit of room sound to it as well. You can switch between a dynamic and a condenser mic. Just bear in mind a condenser is going to sound more bright, but a dynamic is going to sound more full. And you can, again, use dual output or mono output. I'm using dual because I like the stereo image, but mono will remove it and sound more like 1 amp rather than 2, right? Again, dry wet. And you don't have to use this on synths or leads. You can use it on anything just to get the cool kind of muffled amp effect. Just to make anything sound organic and recorded, really. So Drums Bus is that perfect device for adding that extra flavor, fullness, and grit on your overall drums group, hence the name Drums Bus. I've got a drum loop here with a few different hits and loops all combined into one, so it's basically a Drums Bus. Let's listen to it with off. Sounds nice, but we could add a bit more character, I reckon. So let's enable this and you'll see immediately how it changes it. There's more crispiness, more crunch, more edge, more saturation. It's just nice for adding that extra oomph in your drums. Now, there's a few different things you can control here, namely the drive is the most important one for adding more grit. But also the crunch adds more distortion to the high mids, which is great for getting those edgy drums that poke through the mix every single time. You do have to be careful with this one though, so I only use a little bit of it in most cases. I also like to flick on the compression here, and especially if I'm using this as a dry wet effect, which I'll get into in a second, it sounds really beefy. This applies it before the distortion, so it can be helpful just to control the sound a bit more before you kind of brutalize it with this drive. You can also increase the intensity of this distortion with different modes here. Basically, medium and hard kind of sound more like clipping and limiting rather than just normal saturation. Hard is a bit too intense for me in most cases, but if you're making hardstyle or really aggressive dance music, this probably makes sense. Damp also is great. It does remove a lot of the high frequencies by default, which is why you might find the dullness of your drums is lost when you add this plugin on, but just bring it up to 20K if you want to remove that effect. However, sometimes it's nice to take the edge off this, your drums, so it's kind of a cool effect to have on there sometimes. You can also allow the transients just to poke through. One way emphasizes it on the low end, and one way emphasizes it on the high end, so depending on what kind of punch you want to add to your drums is which way you're going to go here. Boom actually adds kind of like an 808 type rumble to the sound. Now, bear in mind, if you've got a separate sub bass, you probably don't want to be doing this, but it is a powerful technique if you want to add that punch to your kick drum. I'm just going to crank it up here and you can choose the frequency. One cool thing is it actually tells you the note of the frequency when you change this knob, so you can kind of see down here at the bottom. And you can change the decay, which will determine how long the note rings out for. You can solo the boom there too. I like to use shorter, subtler ones to just add more of a oomph rather than a full-on trap kind of esque tail to it. And then lastly, you can control the output volume and the dry wet. So I love to use this on dry wet because it is too much sometimes. So again, dynamic tube is one of those less commonly used ones, but it's great for adding a very nice kind of harmonic, pleasant distortion to any sort of sound. Now I've got a nice filter bass here going on, just like kind of a nice synth wavy pattern. But with the dynamic tune, it just adds a bit more grit, but it's like really pleasant, and you'll hear what I mean. It's kind of like hard to tame, but it just sounds so like nice to listen to. The way this works is basically you've got a standard drive control down the bottom left here, which obviously is what adds the grit, right? The more you add, the more it sounds like that. But the tone and bias come into play here quite a bit. What this tone does is it distributes the distortion across different frequency bands differently depending on the control. So one end might be more low end weighted, the other end may be more high end weighted. So let's play around with this. So that's quite gritty there. It's distorting a lot more of the low end. And the bias kind of makes the tube behave differently. Tubes are physical devices, so this is modeling a physical tube distortion unit. And bias kind of breaks it a bit, so I don't use it too much. You can also compensate with the output. I do find the dynamic tube loses a bit of volume, so it's nice to sometimes recoup that with the output there. This envelope setting as well kind of is the dynamic part of the dynamic tube. So it actually moves different parts of the audio into the tube higher than others, giving it this gritty characteristic. So a plucky sound is going to sound really gritty when that pluck first hits this unit. Really awesome. And then you can also shape the attack and release of this envelope so it can act faster or slower depending on the type of sound you've got. In this case, I liked the settings that were here. And then you can also shape the tube based on different models. So these are different types of tubes. A sounds quite clean. B is kind of nice, a bit more gritty, and then C is just completely broken. See, it's like, doesn't really do what you want it to, but it can be nice just to add this kind of flimsy kind of distortion to a sound. Doesn't sound very bright. So Erosion is one of my favorite super simple devices in Ableton. It's unique, and I don't think there's really anything like it in any other DAW. I'm gonna bring on a new one here and then show you how I've used it later in this little moment. But basically, you bring it on. Here's the sound without Erosion. And then here's the sound with Erosion on the default settings. Nothing, right? So let's bring up this amount. Now we start to hear it. Then we can, again, use this XY axis to control the amount and frequency target of the sound. So obviously, higher frequency is going to sound a little more bright, lower frequencies are going to sound a little more body-like. And then you've got 3 different modes: noise, wide noise, and side. We were just using side. Noise is nice. You can actually control the width of the effect as well. It just adds a bit more modulated noise to the signal. Great for kind of adding this gritty analog type effect. Kind of sound like it's being played on a vinyl record. Width makes the effect of the noise wider and more full spectrum. I don't like to use that all the time, so I just kind of bring it down like this. Wide noise is the same, except it's slightly different between the left and right channels, so it's a bit of a wider effect in the stereo image. But my favorite is just the sine. Now I've just used it to add some noise on this glowing filaments preset here in Ableton. Really nice, subtle effect sometimes. There you have it. If you haven't figured it out by now, a lot of the Ableton audio effects are modeled off guitar type effects, and Overdrive is no different. It's a very simple device, but it creates that nice overdriven, kind of ridiculously distorted sound that it's known for. Here's a nice bass sound without Overdrive, and here it is with Overdrive. Really gritty and just beefy, right? It's different to the different types of distortion we've covered, so it's kind of, you have to pick out the nuances between the different devices here. Now, again, you can control the drive. That's the main way the sound changes over time, depending on how beefy you want to go. Tone kind of makes it either weighted towards the high end or the low end. Sometimes it's nice to have a bit of a duller effect. Sometimes you want it brighter. And then you've got a frequency target here, which will target the input frequency that gets overdriven. So if you don't want, for example, the low end to get driven into this unit, you can actually take it out by just controlling this XY panel here. So this is really nice if you want to add nice distorted tones to your sound by using the dry wet and the filter in conjunction. The Dynamics additionally basically uses some sort of compression algorithm to make the sound more dynamic or less dynamic. I kind of like to leave it on low because it sounds more like a traditional distortion unit. However, if you like this like more unruly bright distortion, Dynamics can go up and you can kind of see how that affects your sound there. Again, I think lower is better in most cases for me. Using the same example here, I've just got the pedal device, which is the next one we're going to get to, which also has an overdrive model in addition to a distort and fuzz model. So this again is a guitar type effect, and it just adds a nice different type of grit. You know, we've got different options here. It's nice to have them. Now the overdrive in the pedal does sound different to the overdrive here. You can, again, use the gain here to drive up the signal, and you can switch the mode depending on what you want. Using the output here to control any additional volume that's added. You've got EQ control here to, again, it's kind of like the amp device, control which frequencies you want to be prevalent in the pedal distortion. More brightness, less mids, maybe more bass. And then this mid frequency actually determines which range the mid frequency consists of. So if you want it to be more weighted towards the low end, you can do this. If you want it to be more weighted towards the high end, you can do this. You can actually add in a nice sub boost as well with this effect, which is good for bass sounds or sounds that lack a clear, solid tone. And then again, dry wet. So this is just a nice, fun extra tool to have in your arsenal for distortion. I like to use the fuzz one a lot because it's just nothing like it in the other Ableton devices and sounds really cool. Redux has had a fresh upgrade in Ableton Live 11, and it's a downsampler and bit crusher all in one. However, the new version has a few extra controls to make it sound a bit more analog and unique. Have a listen to this bells example here. It's the perfect sound for adding a bit of a digital edge to, which is what Redux excels at. So let's enable it and listen to how it sounds. Now, these are some custom settings that I've used to make it sound kind of more lo-fi and gritty. However, you don't have to use it exactly as I am. So I'm going to bring a new instance of and delete my original one. Now, the rate here controls the sample rate, which basically is how often it's listening to the audio. And if we degrade this, we're getting less of the audio coming through. It's kind of chopping chunks out, creating this nice kind of gritty, edgy effect, right? Let's listen to it now. Sometimes it's about 18 kilohertz there, just gives it that nice old school sampler feel. You can add a bit of jitter to add some randomness to this effect. And then on the other side, you've got the bit depth reduction, which it's kind of like on a ladder. You can't just like climb indefinitely. You have to go to the next rung. And bits basically snaps each part of the loudness to a different rung. And depending on how many bits you have is how many different levels. So the lower the bits, the less options for loudness the waveform has to snap to, adding this kind of compression loudness effect. If you want Game Boy effects, Redux is your boy. And then shape kind of also changes the characteristic of how this bit depth reducer does its algorithm. So it's just nice to play around with this and see the different effects you can get. And then this new pre and post filter is really fun on the rate because it adds a filter pre or post the sample rate reduction or both, and it kind of adds a muffled sound to it. So I really like to use this to get those lo-fi effects. And you can change the filter octave here to kind of offset the filter, which is determined by the rate knob, up or down below where the rate is. So it's kind of nice to get a bit more brightness or a bit more dullness to the sound depending on which way you're going. Pre is my personal favorite though. And then you got a dry wet and that's it. If you haven't got some headphones on, make sure you do now because we're about to dive into the world of Saturator. Now, Saturator is a great all-rounder that I use all the time for mixing and sound design alike. To show you this example, I've just got a simple sine wave loaded up on Operator because I really want to show you how a Saturator affects different sounds. So off first, and then on. Now, this might sound very subtle, but it actually makes a big difference in terms of the harmonics in the sound. In fact, if we load up an EQ really quick here, we've added a whole extra part of the sound here on the frequency spectrum. And this is where saturation excels. So it can be subtle or it can be absolutely ridiculous. We've just gone back to our default settings for Saturator. And again, the drive here is really what determines the sound. But in addition to the drive amount and then obviously the output that you kind of compensate it by, we've got different modes here that allow you to change the characteristic of the saturation. Certain ones will sound more subtle, others will sound more distorted. Others will sound more unique. And then you've got the wave shaper option, which has a bunch of extra controls, which I'll get to in a bit. But in addition to the drive, you've got these bass and EQ controls down here, which basically determine which frequencies, whether low or high frequencies, the distortion will be applied to. So this is great for characterizing your distortion in different ways. For example, this is driving the low frequencies into it quite a lot. And then you can also control this EQ boost, which is by this depth knob. Frequency determines where, and the width determines the width of the bell curve. So obviously we've got dry wet, and this additional soft clip option provides an extra layer of saturation on the output to ensure nothing goes over 0 dB, which is nice. Now back to the wave shaper module. We've got different controls here, which I just basically like to play around with. It's really nice just to kind of see which shapes you can create and get some really unique distortion types. Really fun to play around with. I just experiment and see what you get out. And to top off drive and color, we've got the vinyl distortion device, which is again underrated, but I think really powerful because what it does is it mimics the distortion that is added by something being pressed to vinyl and worn out over time. You know, when you play a record too many times, that's what vinyl distortion is. I've just got a nice little vocal here, which I'm going to use. I'm going to enable it. And I'm going to start actually with the pinch model, which is one of the two down here, the tracing and the pinch. The pinch adds a lot of the distortion. So I'm going to bring this up on the XY control here. Just make it a little subtle effect here. This is that harmonic distortion that happens to old records. If it's too much, it can be a bit unpleasant, so I don't like to overdo it. And the tracing model also adds a bit more distortion in a different way. So it's kind of like mimicking two different types of distortion that records introduce. So let's bring this up as well. I'm gonna bring up the width of the effect too. I'm gonna add a bit of just top end with this one and a bit of mid-range with this one. We can also change the pinch mode to hard if we want. Hard actually sounds a little more subtle at lower levels, so I kind of like to use it to control the sound of it more. You got stereo and mono for the pinch model, depending on whether you want to add stereo effects, so it's going to distort the left, right, and right differently to one another. You can additionally add this crackle in the background, which is just the standard vinyl crackle. I like to use this sometimes, but I also sometimes prefer to add a sample underneath on a different track. And then the density is of the different, how thick the crackle sounds basically, which is quite nice. And then you can also just bring back the overall effect of the distortion with this drive here. So you can make it a more subtle or obvious effect. Okay, we're gonna kick off the dynamics section with the one and only compressor, one of the most versatile devices. Now, I'm using it on drums here, but you can use this on vocals, basses, guitars, pianos, synths, drums. Really good just to control dynamics in a very predictable and consistent way. Now, in this case, I am going to just enable it on these drums. I'll play it without the compression on first. Some nice stepping DnB drums there. Let's enable this compressor here, and you'll notice I've already tweaked some of the settings to be ideal for these drums. And I'm just using this as a parallel compressor because of this 40% dry wet, meaning that it's only applying a little bit of the compression effect. It's not fully engaged. The background of the drums is now brought up. And this is just one of the many cases that compression can be used. Now, I'll go over the basic controls, but if you do want a more comprehensive guide to compression, I'll leave a link to my article on the EDMProd blog below for that. You've got ratio, which determines how intense the compression is. So 4:1 ratio, which is exactly what we've got here pretty much, is going to reduce every 4 dB that goes over is going to go down to 1 dB. Every 8 dB is going to go to 2 dB. Every 12 dB is going to go to 3 dB. So it's really compressing the sound that's coming in. And then the threshold determines exactly where the signal will start compressing. So the more lower it is, the more of the volume, the more of the signal will get compressed. Higher means less of it will get compressed. Attack and release determine how fast or slow the compressor reacts to incoming audio. And then as it goes out as well with the release there, which you can set to auto if you're not sure what to do. You got 3 different views depending on what you like to look at. I like this show activity view because it just looks a lot nicer. You can also control the knee, which kind of softens the ratio, meaning it's not all of a sudden engaging right on this threshold. It kind of comes in over time and it's more of an organic, slow effect. You can even look at what this effect does when you look at this transfer curve view. It softens the compression there. Especially at higher ratios, you'll notice this as well. By default, Ableton has it set to 6, which is quite a nice middle ground in most use cases. So I don't tend to change this a lot unless I really know what I'm doing. Look ahead is sometimes nice to use if you want to avoid any obvious clicks or pops that your compression is causing. You can control your makeup gain, which I sometimes have on. Sometimes it's a bit too loud. So what you have to do is just kind of vibe it depending on the different sound or different example you're using it on. Sometimes it's nice just to let it decide how much to bring up the volume once it's been compressed, because compression does reduce volume. Who would have thought? Or sometimes it's just nice to manually do it with this output gain meter here. 3 different compression modes. One of them is an expansion, which actually does the opposite of compression if you're wanting to make sounds louder instead of quieter. And then you can control it all with a dry wet to make it as subtle or as obvious as you'd like it to be. You've also got sidechain settings, which is how I like to do it. You can bring the audio from another device, for example, a kick drum, and allow it to duck based on the kick drum or other instruments audio level rather than being self-referential and listening to itself. So this is how you get that kick-based ducking effect. Again, that's something I've covered in plenty of other videos, but if you'd like me to do it, leave a comment and I'll do something on that as well. Gates are typically used to remove noise or unwanted background noise from a recording or sound, but apart from this mixing application, it can also be used as a sound design tool. And I'll actually leave a video from Luca, who's done a video on this channel using gates for creative sound design purposes. But let's look at this drum loop here and give it a listen. You'll notice that there's some background drums, which we could, if we wanted to, remove from the signal in order to just focus on the main hits. So there's some background hats and other stuff. Now I'm going to enable this gate and then we can listen to what it sounds like with the gate on. And now you can hear that the kicks and the snares are the only real hits coming through. The hats are a little bit more quiet and kind of stripped back. Now it does this by setting a threshold, and anything below this threshold will actually be turned down or silenced depending on the other settings. The return creates a second threshold for sounds that are returning down from coming through. This just allows certain sounds like a kick or a snare that has come through past the threshold to ring it out a little longer so it doesn't snap back as soon as it hits that original threshold. It's kind of like a buffer zone if you think of it like that. The characteristics of the gate are controlled by the attack, hold, and release. This determines how quickly or slowly the gate will react to incoming audio, and how loud it will stay open or closed, so how long the hits or whatever will come through the gate. Now the floor determines how much the sounds below the thresholds are turned down. At the moment it's -20, but we can bring it all the way down so it's pure silence. Which is quite nice. I'm going to add a bit of attack there to remove the click. You can also flip the gate so anything above the threshold will be silenced and anything below will be brought on. So that's another way you can use it. It's kind of like an inverse gate. And then some look ahead if you just want to remove clicks or, you know, any sort of large changes in the dynamics of the audio are compensated for. One of my personal favorite ways is to chuck this on after a delay or something and let the gate bring the delay in and out to kind of change the characteristic of that. Okay, so onto Glue Compressor, which is by far my favorite Ableton mixing device. Now, unlike the other compressor, the Glue Compressor is modeled off an analog SSL style bus compressor, giving it this unique brightness and analog quality to it, which makes drums or anything on a bus level just glued together and sound really nice. I like to use it as both a compressor and a clipper with this soft clip option. You can just drive the makeup gain and basically treat it as a soft clipper, which is really cool. But in terms of compression, you've got the same standard controls on a compressor: attack, release, ratio, and threshold. The difference is these have predefined intervals, so you can't scale it to the exact control, which kind of gives you less options and is nice with like more of an analog style workflow. It means that you're not overthinking each decision and you can just focus on making things sound good. So I like to sometimes, with a drum example, using the exact same drum loop from the previous device, we can kind of give it a bit of an attack to allow the transients to come through. Fairly normal release, 200 milliseconds, and just a ratio of 2, so we're gently massaging the sound. And then just bring down the threshold until we see this needle move. Once the needle starts moving, we know we're getting gain reduction, so that we know that the compression is being applied. Now, bear in mind, this needle is an analog VU style meter, so it means it's not going to show us as instantaneous as, say, the meters on Ableton, how loud the audio is. It's more of an average value. You can hear that the kick drum here is being controlled quite a bit. Then we can bring up the makeup gain to control that. We can see the clipping engaged there so that nothing is going over 0 dB. We can scale back the compression amount with this range knob, which basically acts as a limiter for the amount of compression that's allowed to be applied. So if it's a bit too much, you can always scale this back instead of just scaling down the threshold. It's kind of a different taming effect, I find. And then dry wet also allows you to bring in a bit of that original signal so you don't lose all the punch of your drums by adding compression. You can also right click on the top here, enable oversampling. This just allows the Glue Compressor to remain the highest quality possible when you're processing any types of audio in Ableton. Now, I don't use the Ableton limiter all the time, but it is good in specific circumstances. The reason I avoid it is because it's not a good brick wall limiter, so I will never use it on my master to avoid anything going over 0 dB, simply because it's not a very good algorithm and it squashes the audio a bit too much. But if you're just wanting to make sure, nothing kind of hits that 0 dB and you're not trying to maximize the loudness of your signal, this could be the perfect thing to use on, say, an individual kick drum channel or bass or whatever. I've got it on some drums here, and I'm just going to demonstrate how it works. You just simply gain it up to increase the loudness, and you'll start to see when limiting is applied when there's some yellow on this gain reduction meter here. So that's starting to compress that kick drum a bit. We can go further. And that's applying a bit more limiting now. And obviously you can go too crazy. I'm going to add a utility just to bring down the volume in case it's too loud on your end. But you can hear now that it's a bit too squashed, right? That kick drum is really taking over. So I don't like to use it for extreme loudness applications. And then you can also use this ceiling just to give it a bit of headroom under 0 dB. That allows for things like conversion to different audio formats down the line. Sometimes that adds in some artifacts which go over 0 dB, so this allows for that. 1.5 millisecond look ahead. There's no 0 millisecond because it's a limiter. It wants to make sure that nothing is getting through before it has the chance to act on the audio. So I like to use 1.5 or 3. 6 milliseconds isn't necessary in most cases, but sometimes if you've got some crazy audio, it can be nice just to make sure that nothing is going to go over. Again, it adds latency, so that's just worth considering. And then lastly, you've got this release, which I've got it set to auto for now. This adjusts to the type of material that's coming in, but if you like to use a specific type of release value, say you want a more consistent sound and you know what you're doing, you can bring down the release to kind of make it sound louder. And that's limiter. Again, I don't use it on my master bus often, but it's just great as a general tool, almost as a utility in my experience. So Multiband Dynamics in Ableton is where the infamous OTT preset comes from. And it's a super versatile way of controlling dynamics on both the lows, mids, and highs of your signal. Now, this kind of effect can be overdone, and things like OTT are often overdone in electronic music. So it's important to really make sure you're using this device intentionally whenever you're applying it. Now, this doesn't just do compression on both upward and downward levels, so it means it's making the louder parts quieter and the quieter parts louder, but it also makes the quieter parts quieter and the louder parts louder if you so choose to use it in that way. And that's where the power of this device comes in. You've got 3 bands which have different crossovers, so this determines where the low band ends and this determines where the high band starts, and anything else will be scooped up by this mid band here. You can enable each of the bands and turn them off. You can actually disable completely the low or the high to turn it into a 2-band compressor. You can solo particular bands, change the input volume. You've got this softening and RMS modes down the bottom, which I like to leave on because they just sound really good. However, you can disable it and then turn this to peak mode if you like. And then output volume, obviously to control all this sort of stuff. But the real meat of the plugin, or the device should I say, is these controls in the middle here. You can actually control them visually. So this is the threshold for the top, middle, and low band, and same for the downwards band on each of them. And then you can drag in the middle of each of them to turn it into compression or expansion, depending on what you're trying to do, right? And it's quite visual and intuitive because if I drag it down on the end band, I'm expanding down that way. If I drag it up on this band, I'm expanding it that way. Now, in a lot of cases, I'm going to be doing expansion upwards and compression downwards. So we kind of get this audio being squished in the middle. And this is exactly how something like the OTT plugin works. You can see it's very similar in the blue and red bands there. A bit of input gain on these ones, a bit of output gain. And then you've got things like the attack and release for each of these bands. And then you've got the threshold and ratio, which we've just controlled visually in the middle here. But you can also see the numbers for each by clicking B for below. And then the attack and release are universal for both bands or both types of compression or expansion on each band. So you can't, for example, have a 5 millisecond attack for this bottom one here on the high band, and then say a 20 millisecond attack for the top one. It just applies both to both. Now, again, if this isn't something you're super familiar with, I actually have a whole video on both OTT and I have a whole guide on Multiband Dynamics. I'll leave links for both of those in the description so you can really dive and wrap your head around this tool, because it is something worth taking a bit of time out and just exploring. In the meantime, though, I'd highly recommend you check out some of these presets. A few of these are my own created ones, just to see how it affects the sound. For example, OTT versus off really squishes sounds, make them really controlled and bright and just tight sounding. Okay, I think we're over halfway now, but we're at the EQ and filter section, and we're gonna take a dive into auto filter, which again is one of those devices that I use all the time and is actually one of my favorites as well. And the reason I love it so much is because it's not just a normal low pass or high pass or whatever type of filter you want it to be, but it also has these cool modulation options which can add different rhythmic characteristics. And so, for example, I've got this wavetable pad here which sounds like this. Pretty loud and full spectrum, but with this auto filter, I can muffle it and add this really cool effect. Perfect in like a minimal house or deep house track, something like that. But what's going on here is not only have I low passed it, but I've also used a LFO here, which is synced to the BPM. I've used this quantized mode on this envelope as well. So it's kind of like moving the filter up by steps instead of like a smooth motion. Now, if I load a normal filter up, you'll see it functions from the get-go just with the filter and resonance being the main two controls in sculpting the sound. And then obviously you've got different filter types. So you've got a high pass as well, band pass, band reject, and this cool like morph filter, which goes from like low pass to band pass to high pass to band reject and back to low pass. I tend to use the low pass and high pass the most, but then obviously you got this LFO which can be either synced to the BPM or freeform hertz. This just adds a bit of motion based on the amount and rate. You can change the shape to be something more like a saw or something more random like noise. And in addition to this, you've also got this envelope which moves with the incoming audio. So louder parts of the audio will move the filter up, and quieter parts will move it down. And then obviously you can invert that motion so that quieter parts make it go louder and vice versa. And this is really cool because it kind of is the auto part of the filter. And there that is in motion. And the attack and release determines how fast it reacts to that incoming change in dynamics. So if you want a much faster kind of result, that's quite fast. So fast, in fact, it's kind of adding distortion. But if you want something a bit more palatable, this is now reacting to those minor inflections in the audio, meaning it just makes it a little more interesting and characteristic of, say, like an old tape machine or something. And that's basically the power of auto filter. Again, got some great presets you can play around with just to like see how they affect the sound in different ways. You can stack them up. Lots of fun sound design possibilities with this one. Go nuts. And also reverb after filtering always sounds great. Now, if you're like me and you get overwhelmed with the amount of potential EQ changes you can make on a normal parametric EQ, EQ8 is your boy. Because it just is so simple, you can just boost the lows, mids, and highs, or cut the lows, mids, and highs, control a few simple parameters, and it will do a lot of wonders for your mix. Now, I've just got this nice little synth pad loaded up here, and I'm just going to play around with these controls. So first, you'll notice there's a high pass filter you can enable. No frequency cutoff, you can just turn it on at 80 hertz or off. You got the low band, which is set to about 100 hertz. You can bring that up or down. Mid band, you can customize the exact frequency, depending on where you want to target. And then you got a high band, which is about 8 to 20 kilohertz, depending on whether you're cutting or boosting. And then if you do cut, it adds kind of a nice low pass filter in there for you as well. Then you've got an overall output to boost or cut depending on how much volume was added during the EQ process. But that's it. It's kind of like an analog style EQ that's mimicked off the old analog desks. So it makes it really easy just to make something brighter, darker, thinner, fatter without thinking about it too much. I use it on my drums, I use it on my bass, I use it on my music buses to add a bit of pizzazz, and sometimes I even use it on my master, God forbid. Now we're at the OG EQ8. Absolutely amazing, extremely versatile stock EQ that I use on pretty much every channel, give or take a few. Now I'm going to double click on this display to bring it up full mode, which is awesome. I love using this visual all the time. It's got 8 bands, each with a frequency, gain, and Q setting, and the filter mode. So you've got different filter modes that you can switch between for each band. You've got a ×4 high pass, low shelf, bell curve, normal band. You've got a band reject or notch. You've got a high shelf, a low pass, and a 4x low pass. And you can enable and disable each of the bands accordingly here. You can adjust the frequency and gain on the display as well here, and you can option, I think it is, or alt on Windows to change that Q or band setting. You've got a different analysis settings, which I'm not really going to dive into now. You can also solo each bands by pressing this headphone option. So if I was to play something here, and I've just got this little piano chop loaded up, you can hear the exact frequencies that that band is affecting, which is pretty cool. I've got also this scale option. So let's say if you make a few EQ changes and you're happy with it, but you want to scale the changes back or accentuate them even more, you can do that over on the side there. You can also change the gain, etc. And that is basically the main controls. You've also got this A/B mode, which you can enable. If you have 2 sets of EQ settings you'd like to switch between, you can use that as well. Again, if you want the best sound quality, make sure to right click and click oversampling. EQ8 is a really simple EQ, which is actually used mostly for DJing if you're using it live for DJing, but it's also great as a production tool. You've got 3 bands, similar to how channel EQ works, with variable crossovers this time. You can also switch between the 24 or 48 dB octave filter, depending on how steep you want those crossovers to be. 48 sounds a lot more precise, whereas 24 sounds a bit more natural. You can adjust the gain for each of the bands. However, you can only go up 6 dB on each. Again, it's for DJing, it's not really for production. But one thing I really like to use it for, and I've just got a drum loop loaded up here, is to actually switch these bands on and off, and it kind of allows you to isolate just a specific frequency band, which can be nice for like a breakdown or for a specific automation effect during a fill or something like that. Say you just want the mids to come through in the intro. This is where EQ3 has just that little creative usage in the production world as well as the DJ world. So I'm going to dive into the modulators section really quick, and just in this one little moment, because it is a powerful set of tools for controlling different parameters that you can map these things to. So for example, you can map an LFO to this filter cutoff of this synth, or you can map this shaper to the amount of reverb or space in a sound. And it just allows you to add an extra layer of dynamic control, sound design creativity to anything and everything within Ableton. So I'm going to start off with the envelope follower, and I've just got this basic chime sound loaded up. And what you can do is you can map this to, say, the filter cutoff. And now this device is moving the filter cutoff of this analog chime sound, and you can control how it's modulating it with the controls built in. So for starters, you can see the parameter that's mapped to here, and you can change that at any time. You can also see if it's mapped to multiple parameters in this list in the top right. For example, I could also do the FM and control that, but I'm going to remove that for now. And then you can also control just the normal parameter here, the amount of maximum and minimum. So I can control the start, the lowest point, and the highest point of the modulation, which is pretty cool. I can gain up the envelope follower. So the envelope follower obviously matches the incoming loudness of the audio and modulates the parameter accordingly. Kind of like how it works in the auto filter or also in the dynamic tube that we covered earlier in the video. So I'm going to bring this up. just so we get a more obvious effect. You can control the amount of smoothness on the rise and fall of the envelope. So the rise being the start and the fall being going back down. So it makes it a bit more of a subtle effect, but I kind of like it at 0 for this sound. The delay adds a bit of a delay from the actual change in loudness to the movement of the envelope follower. So it kind of creates a bit of a different like effect of dynamics, I suppose you could call it. You can hear it's like a delayed offset of movement. You can sync this also to your host tempo if you like to. Next, we've also got the LFO. Map that there, same controls. You can actually choose the different shapes here from the options. You can go random or bin. I like the triangle or even just the up. You can add a bit of jitter, which is some subtle movement to it, making it a bit more analog and organic. Smooth kind of smooths out the jittering and also the overall waveform. This is how you can get the LFO to sound really, really, really analog. You can change the rate, which can again be synced to the BPM. Sometimes like a half step is nice. Really nice, but also free is fine too. You can adjust the depth of the modulation down so it's a more subtle effect. Also fun to modulate this over time. And then you can offset the central point of the LFO. So you could, for example, move it up. It's kind of like the control for the original control. Phase adjustment basically just changes the start point of the LFO. And then lastly, we've got Shaper, which is kind of like LFO, but more controllable. So we can actually create a very specific shape here, not specific to just the standard LFO shapes, and then use this to move any parameter. We can change up the grid here and draw in our own shapes. We've got our jitter and smooth again. Our rate and depth, phase, and then offset as well. And that's pretty much it. Shaper's really fun just to play around with. You can get some really trippy shapes if you want to go all in. You can adjust the curves by pressing Alt. And just kind of go nuts, really. Now, I will mention that there are other CV modulators you can get in third-party packs and other types of modulators, but these are the main ones that I use and a lot of people use every day in Ableton. Now, it's worth remembering that these don't process audio by themselves, so leaving them on a track unmapped won't actually do anything. You need to map it to something for there to be any changes. Okay, we're getting onto the pitch and modulation section, and we're going to kick things off with the AutoPan device. Now, I've just got a nice musical sample here loaded up. And what's interesting about AutoPan is you can actually use it as a panner as well as a tremolo effect. I'm going to start by bringing up the amount here, and you'll notice on this display, you'll be able to see the resulting shape that's created. Great for mixing, great for adding a bit of interest and pulling things out of the mix that otherwise would be too central. And you can obviously take things further than that by adjusting the rate, finding a nice midway point with the amount. You can also invert the panning so the left goes right and vice versa. You can sync it to either the BPM or free, like most of the devices in Ableton, which is sick. But then you get to the phase knob. And this is where you can actually bring the phase back down to 0, and you'll notice the yellow and blue lines here align back to this normal one blue line. And this is where we can treat it like a tremolo device. So meaning it's a mono panner, and it sounds like this. Nice effect for those transitions where things kind of just come in, in a melodic house track or something like that. But you can also add this cool spin effect, which kind of moves them out of time as the song progresses. So you can hear they start central and then they move apart over time. Very random, but cool for trippy sound design. And then you can also change the shape to something a little more square by moving the shape up. You can also change the waveform to be a triangle, a saw, or a noise shape. Simple volume changes. but something that can add the extra little bit of dynamic or motion to your mix. Quick clothing change break because I'm totally filming this all in the same day. All right, onto Chorus and Ensemble. This device is again an expansion of a previous Chorus device into something a lot more feature rich. However, partially I do miss the old Chorus sometimes because it had a few different controls this new one doesn't. But if we switch this on after we listen to this E-piano example, you'll notice it instantly adds more richness to the sound. It thickens it up, makes it a bit more detuned, and just sounds really pleasant to the ear. So there's 3 modes here. You've got Classic, which is a classic chorus, Ensemble, which is more of a thicker kind of ensemble sounding chorus if you think of an orchestra, and then you've got Vibrato, which is not a chorus at all, and it just adds a bit of pitch wobble to a sound, which is a new addition to the chorus device in 11. I like to use the standard classic chorus, play around with the rate and amount, which determines the wobble and the amplitude of the effect. And then I also like to play around with this width knob to make the effect more exaggerated in the stereo. You can crank the feedback to get some cool trippy effects. Add a high pass filter just to cut out any low end artifacts or anything like that. You can change this warmth knob up just to add a bit of saturation to the output. Kind of makes it sound like an old school chorus. You got output control and then again, dry wet. Similar with the Ensemble, and then Vibrato just doesn't have a feedback option, but has some extra controls to control the shape of the vibrato. You can offset it for left and right and also change the actual shape from a sine to a triangle wave there. Kind of nice. So onto Phaser-Flanger, which combines the 2 existing Phaser and Flanger devices in Ableton into one superpower-laden awesome thing, with the addition of this new doubler mode, which I'll get to in a second. So similar to the Chorus Ensemble, you've got 3 different modes, Phaser, Flanger, and doubler. Phaser acts as a phaser, sounds like this. Flanger acts as a flanger, sounds like this. Especially when you crank the feedback, and then doubler sounds like this. So each have a unique thickening sonic characteristic, which is nice for different kind of use cases. Phaser adds a bit of thin movement to the sound. Flanger is nice for adding kind of metallic motion to sounds, and doubler is nice if you want something similar to a chorus, but something a bit more halfway between a chorus and a vibrato. I think it kind of doubles the signal and pitches them away from each other consistently. Starting with the Phaser, you can control the amount of notches, which makes it more kind of resonant sounding in my opinion. The central frequency determines where the Phaser kind of sits, so if you want it to be weighted towards a low end or high end. And then the spread spreads out the notches so it can be more of a full spectrum effect. Generally, I find that more notches sounds more digital, whereas less notches sounds more analog. Blend kind of just blends the movement of the different notches away from each other, so the lower ones will move one way and the upper ones will move another way. You can control the motion with the amount, feedback, and rate. The rate changes how fast. The amount changes how much each notch moves, and feedback sends the input back in so it's being affected again and again and again. We've also got a warmth knob, like the Chorus Ensemble, does the same sort of thing. You've got a Flanger, which simply just has a time control. Same amount and rate. The time control determines the metallic character of the sound, by the way. And then same other control. And then doubler, you've just got a time control, which basically more time equals more detune. So I kind of like to use shorter times personally. And then if you send it into the feedback, you get this nice kind of delayed effect because it's going back into the delay and kind of doubling it again and again and again. And then all of this can be blended back with the dry wet knob, which of course is quite common when you're using this device. I find the Phaser, Flanger, or doubler is just a bit too much on its own in most cases, unless of course you're going for a very specific effect. But this works well on pads like this example here, works well on anything musical, even drums. I've heard people use phasers and flangers on fills and stuff like that. So Shifter is an interesting new device. Again, it's an upgrade of the existing frequency shifter device with the addition of this new pitch mode, which is now the default setting. Starting with pitch, what this allows you to do is essentially take any incoming audio and adjust the pitch of it based on different size grains depending on this window. So if we listen to this original sample, which is like a nice atmospheric impact, we can then play it and see what happens when we move this coarse and fine knob over time. Fine's more the fine pitch, coarse is more in semitone steps, so it's a more obvious effect. Then you can control the window to change the amount of grains, which can be nice depending on what kind of effect you're going for. You can set this wide button to give it a nice stereo effect. Then you can control any additional harsh high end, which is added sometimes by pitching things up with this tone control. You can add a delay to this effect, which sends it back into the shifter and adds like this nice pitching effect. Works really nice with octaves to kind of get this similar effect to a grain delay. You can see how much fun this device ends up being. You can also control the coarse amount with this LFO here. You've got sync controls, different shapes. You've got different spin controls and phase controls if you want to adjust the left and right. And then you can also just create this crazy shapes with this Judy cycle effect, which I don't really know how it works, but it's just fun to create these weird effects. You got an envelope follower like the envelope follower modulator I showed you earlier. Control the amount. Attack and release settings for that. And then of course you've got the two other modes, frequency and ring, which function very much like a frequency shifter and a ring modulator. Frequency shifter is similar to pitch, but it actually moves all the frequencies up via addition, whereas pitch is multiplication. So if you're a maths whiz and knows what that means, if you're not, then it basically just sounds like a different type of pitch shifting. This is more for creative atonal sound design, so it's not the same effect as pitch shifting. You got the same controls for all these. And then you got ring modulation, which just kind of is a sort of amplitude modulation, but slightly different. At low values, it sounds like a tremolo effect. Again, all the same effects apply with any of these. You can also drive the output, which is just a nice way to get a bit of saturation without clipping the sound. I don't know why they added it, but it's just nice to have this option. And we're on to the second last section now, which is reverb and resonance. So Corpus is one of Ableton Live's more unique devices. It basically takes a physical modeling engine and applies it to any sound that's coming in via the input. This means you can make anything sound like a marimba, for example. Got a bass guitar here. You can make it sound like a beam, a string, a membrane, kind of like a xylophone or something. Plate, pipe, tube. You got all these different physical modeling settings which allows you to mimic real life sound. Now, I probably need a whole separate video for Corpus, but basically the main functionality you want to be aware of is this setting here. You've got quality setting for each of the different modes. Each of the different modes will have a variety of different settings, with the decay and material knobs here changing the main characteristic. You've got some width and position knobs, which kind of move it around the stereo field. You've got some brightening in harmonic settings, which all of these will change depending on the different settings you choose. As you can see, this one's changed to opening. You can actually tune the effect of the Corpus to a certain note. You can spread it out, kind of making it a bit thicker, giving it like a detuned effect, which can be quite nice. You can also set MIDI input from the original channel, but that it actually affects the tune in a pitched way. And that kind of allows you to get some cool harmonic effects as you play Corpus. You've got an LFO and filter to move some of the controls, which is quite nice. This bleed knob here is kind of like dry wet, but it's a bit different because it allows the original signal to come in just so the high end stays intact. It's not the full signal, if that makes sense. And then you've got a normal dry wet knob here just to control the overall sound of the effect. Have fun with this device. Again, I'll probably be doing a separate video on this more in depth later. So next we've got the brand spanking new hybrid reverb, which is different to the original reverb device, which I'll be getting to in a couple of devices down the video. But this one is more powerful and more feature rich for a good reason, because it adds a convolution engine. Now, a convolution engine is basically a real world reverb applied to a digital sound. And this is done by capturing an impulse response, which is a little snippet of audio of a little blip played in a real space, captures the characteristics of that room and applies it to the sound we've got in the DAW. So if you want to put your sound in Taj Mahal, you can if you've got an impulse response of the Taj Mahal. But what's powerful about hybrid reverb is it combines that with a standard algorithmic reverb, which is how the normal reverb plugins work. A lot of the controls are going to be kind of similar to what we'll cover in reverb, so I'll kind of leave a lot of it for that. But what's important to know here is that you've got a standard dry wet, obviously, to control the overall effect of the reverb. So if I add it to this little ARP we've got here, which sounds like this dry, and then sounds like this with reverb on, we can change the dry wet here to control the amount of reverb. And a lot of these controls down here control mostly the algorithmic reverb, whereas these settings at the beginning here control the impulse response. So this is the convolution, this is the algorithm. And in the middle here, we can choose the algorithm processing between the two. So for example, do we want to process the original signal with the convolution first, then the algorithmic, or do we want to process them separately and then combine them at the end together, or do we want to just use one or the other? So you got the option of doing all those, where you can blend also how much of each of them you get, which is really, really nice. Now you've got standard settings like pre-delay, you've got the send, this is the amount of the original signal that's sent into the reverb, so it's like a kind of like a pre-gain. You can also do some feedback, which is pretty cool because it basically sends the original signal back in and kind of gives it this nice thick reverb effect. There you go. You get that big long delay when you get nice long feedbacks. You can choose one of your favorite impulse responses. These all sound different if we just listen to the convolution engine for a second. You can control the actual characteristics with this decay knob, size. I generally like to leave it on full there. You can add a bit of attack just to make the original sound of the reverb a bit more subdued and mostly make it weighted on the tail. And then obviously you've got a bunch of different algorithms for the algorithmic reverb. If we just listen to these, Shimmer kind of acts as like a Valhalla Shimmer reverb if you're familiar with that. Tides is also phenomenal. Just really beautiful sounding. And then Prism. Each of these has different characteristics, but if you want to know the specific differences, check out the manual for more info. You can also multiply the algorithmic reverb for the low end or high end, depending on these low mult and high mult ones. You can control the crossover between these two effects with this crossover. You got size and decay, which I'll be covering in a bit, stereo amplification or attenuation if you want that. You got a vintage mode, which you can switch on, which adds a bit of bit depth reduction, kind of like Redux to the reverb signal. You can get really disgustingly dirty with extreme. Especially if we listen to just the wet signal. And you can monitor the bass if you want to control under 180 hertz. You know, depending on the original signal, sometimes the low end can get quite stereoized with reverb. So this controls it back in with some monoing. And then again, dry wet. So Resonators is one of those lesser used devices that has a lot of power under the hood if you take the time to just dive into it. I personally like to start, unlike other devices, with a preset and kind of navigate from there because it is a bit of work to get this device sounding the way you want it to. But a lot of these nice presets here in Ableton have these nice chordal effects. But what Resonators is actually doing if we drag on a new instance is it's basically taking the original's incoming sound, and in this case I've chosen some atonal noise with no pitch, and it applies some resonance to the sound, kind of like a metallic-y sort of resonance, right? And you can actually set up to, I think, 5 different resonances here in order to create different harmonic intervals. So I could do something like this. And then you can also adjust the input filter. This is going to allow the resonators to target a very specific frequency range. If we go to 100% wet there, you'll hear what I mean. Or we could turn that off and just have it applying on the whole spectrum. You can change this decay to change the length of the resonance, change the color of the mode. Speaking of the mode, there are 2. A and B sounds slightly different. B is a little more lower and deeper, whereas A has a bit more body. You got the width control, you got gain control, and then dry wet. I like this Paris preset because it's quite a nice chordal effect. Obviously the gain's cranked up quite a bit here. I particularly love to combine this with something like reverb to create these really lovely pad effects. So as I've mentioned, the Reverb device is classic in Ableton Live, and it's just got a new facelift in the Live 11 edition, which makes it a little bit easier to use. Now, I find myself reaching for this constantly. I use it in pretty much every song I make, and it's really, really technical, so I can get the exact sound out of the reverb that I'm after. Now, with that being said, it does still look a little bit daunting, so I'm going to go over the main controls and then show you a few examples of the more advanced features towards the end. The most important thing to note is the pre-delay. So I'm just going to play this example of this ARP here without the reverb on, and then I'll play it with. Now, listening to the pre-delay, we can already hear the reverb starting to come in there. This affects the delay between the reverb starting on the signal. So this is to mimic the natural effect of a reverb in a real world space. It doesn't immediately start happening. There is a bit of natural delay before that actually kicks in. Now, bigger amounts tend to have bigger results, so it sounds a little bigger on the actual reverb sound. In addition to this, the decay and size determine both the bigness and the length of the reverb. Longer decays will sound longer. Shorter decay is shorter. And then size controls the bigness or how big the reverb sounds. So shorter sounds like a small room, whereas bigger sounds like a bigger space. This can all be controlled with the dry wet, which blends the original dry signal with the reverb signal. And then you've also got these 2 knobs here, which are reflect and diffuse, which can boost or cut the sound of the reverb, the reflections being the beginning of the reverb and the diffusions being the end tail. Speaking of reflections and diffusions, this is where this black section comes in. So this first half is all about the early reflections, and the second half is all about the diffusion. So we can start with this input filter, which allows us to cut out certain parts of the reverb in the lows or highs. This is great if you've got some harsh bass tones or some harsh high end, which you just don't want to be affected by the reverb. You want to kind of leave it dry. You can use this XY pad and enable these buttons. And if you hear it on 100% wet, this is the part of the original signal that's being affected by the reverb. Bring this back down. Next, we've got earlier reflections, which controls how sudden or smooth the original part of the reverb sounds. So again, this is that first part of the reverb you hear when you first hear it. We can bring this shape down and play around with it. Lower values kind of sound a bit more robotic to me, whereas higher ones sound a bit more smooth and natural. I like to kind of go somewhere in between. And then you've got these spin controls, which add a bit of natural chorus motion to the original early reflections, making the reverb just sound a little bit more natural. So you can play with those or disable it if you want a more predictable signal. Next, we've got the diffusion network. We can actually just use this XY pad to basically cut the lows or highs of our reverb tail. This just allows us to sculpt the reverb to our exact specifications. If it's too much high end in the reverb, we can just cut it out here. If it's too much low end, we can cut it out here. This is different to the input filter. This is actually the effect of the reverb. So how the reverb decays over time for certain frequencies. So it will sound different to the input filter. Additionally, you got this diffusion control. At higher values, it sounds kind of thicker, especially if we have it up high. At lower values, it sounds a little more thinner, kind of similar to how shape functions in my opinion. And scale, higher values just kind of make it sound a bit more natural to me, whereas lower values just sound a bit more random and sparse and a bit brighter too. Great. We've also got some stereo control where we can control the stereo image of our sound. We can control the quality of the reverb with this high, low, mid, and sparse. And that is pretty much the main controls for reverb. So there's a lot of control here. I recommend flicking through some of the presets if you want a great place to start, because there's so many good ones that I still use even though I know the specifics of how to use the reverb. So Spectral Resonator is again a new device along with Spectral Time that allows you to get some really cool digital effects, this time more on the harmonic side rather than the time stretch side. But I've just got this pad example loaded up here and I want to show you the real interesting power behind this device. At the moment, it's just 100% dry, so there's no wet signal. But notice what happens when I start to introduce some of the dry signal here. We're getting this really cool kind of digital watery layer being added. And that's where Spectral Resonator comes in really well. Now, by default, you don't have any MIDI input, but I'm actually inputting the MIDI notes from what's being played here on the piano roll. And this is allowing the pitch of Spectral Resonator to change along with the notes. So that's why it works so well. But you can have this off by default if you want to just have it on internal. This is more of a static note, so it's a bit different. I like having it on MIDI though, because I find the majority of the power of this device comes from having it synced to our MIDI notes in terms of pitch. It resonates different parts of the sound depending on these modes here. Now, there's 4 different modulation modes. There's none, which is no modulation, which basically just resonates at different intervals. Chorus does it in a bit of a thicker modulated way. Wonder is, again, just a bit more random. And then granular is basically like it granulizes the sound and gets these really nice grains. This is one of my favorites. Especially as you shift this control down here, which kind of changes the input pitch, not the actual notes that are resonating. So that's the key here. Is this kind of almost is like a frequency shifter, like it skews it towards the high end or the low end, but it doesn't change the pitch. That's what transposition will do here. The decay determines how long each of these little partials ring out in different modes as well. That's why shorter values sound really cool on granular, because you get these nice sparkly effects. You can add unison like I have here to add some thickness, or you can leave it off. Obviously there's a unison amount you can use. You can also control the number of harmonics. Lower sounds more low resolution, kind of almost like a bad MP3, but I like to leave it up there. You can also turn this display on and off, which is really, really cool. You can also bring in some pitch mod. Now we're getting some sick lasery type effects. And you can also control the high frequency and low frequency damp if you want to make things sound a little more natural if there's too much bass or high end. Kind of mutes them a bit rather than just EQing them, so it's quite nice. And yeah, I think the power in this device is really experimenting with different modes. You can try internal. You know, really having fun with the harmonics. The shift, the stretch, kind of, you know, separates out the harmonics, giving it kind of a nice metallic feel. You can just go nuts with this device. So the Vocoder. This device is originally designed to modulate a synth sound with the movement of a vocal, creating these cool robotic digital vocal sounds. However, Ableton's Vocoder is capable of much more than this, as we'll soon explore. But I have set up the standard setup here so you can see how a vocal, which I've got here, sounds when it's got some vocoded layer built in. And I've got this chords layer here as what we call the carrier. This is what's producing the sound that Vocoder is using to then modulate. Now, normally you apply the Vocoder to the modulator channel, so what's making the movement, which in this case is the vocal, and then you route in this carrier section here, the external track within Ableton, and I've routed this vocoder chords track in the audio from section here, post effects, so all the effects that are on the track will be applied to. Now, beyond this, you have a few different modes for the carrier. You can choose the noise to be carrier, which will make it sound like this, especially if you go to 100% wet. And you can control the characteristic of the noise here. You can also use a modulator, which is basically it's self-vocoding, so it's using the vocal itself as the modulator, which I'll get into in a second. And then you can also use pitch tracking, which is basically a pitch tracked oscillator that vocoder generates. But let's go back to external. I like to add this unvoiced in here a bit, which just adds a bit of noise to the signal. You can control whether it's a fast reaction or slow reaction to the audio, and the sensitivity to the incoming audio, so how often the noise comes up. Fast is a bit too digital for me, which is why I leave it on slow. Then you've got the main section here, which is the bands. Now, you can control the amplitude of each of the bands, kind of giving it a unique tone. You control the number of bands if you want it to be more specific, or less if you want it to be more general. The more bands, the more vocally it sounds. You can control the range of these bands with the EQ here. So, for example, do you want it to be full spectrum, or do you want the vocoder just to apply on a smaller range? Bandwidth basically blurs or crosses over or narrows each of these bands so that their frequencies are more deliberate and precise. This sounds quite resonant at low values and quite broad at high values. Again, depending on the different sound you're going for, it's quite nice. The gate kind of gates the incoming audio to make it only the loud parts will come through. I love this for creative sound design because it kind of just lets certain parts of the audio through and it sounds really glitchy. Then you can boost the overall volume of the vocoder output. Depth is also fun to play with. Low values sound more like compressed, whereas high values sound more dynamic. It's almost like an envelope follower for the vocoder, as we've already discussed what an envelope follower is, with attack and release settings here, so you can kind of control how fast that reacts to changes in audio. Formant makes things sound more female or male, or kind of high-pitched or low-pitched if you prefer to think of it like that. And then dry wet kind of makes it, brings in a bit of that original signal. So you can also change the sound here. If I was to, for example, crank it, and now we listen to this version, that change to the original carrier sound also affects the vocoded sound. So onto utilities, we're now going to cover the audio effect track, which is not an effect in itself, but it allows you to group other types of effects that we've already covered into one rack where you can control multiple different parameters with just one knob. And this is great for presets. For example, I've got this rack here, which I've created previously, which has a few devices built in here. If we open up this little show hide devices button, all mapped to one knob. And if I play it on this vocal, you'll hear the effect it has. And this is kind of a nice transition effect that I created, all by mapping just a few parameters. If we go to the M button on here, you can see I've mapped 3 different things up here. I've mapped this knob to the dry-wet split, which is a basically 2 different parallel signal chains. One blends towards the other. It also increases the dry-wet of the ballad reverb, and it also changes the volume or gain on the utility at the end there. So this is all happening on one knob, which I would not be able to do normally, or I would do with great painstaking effort if I was to do it in modulate each one manually. So it would be a lot easier just to use this. Now, you can add as many macros as you want, mapping it to different things. And then now with the most recent update, you can actually randomize these controls each time, so you can see they affect the internal controls as well. You can see also you can create macro variations where you actually save different variations, and then you press new whenever you want to create a new one, and then you can adjust it. So this is really, really cool if you wanted to grab something with, say, a few more knobs, that we can actually go in here, bring in something that has a few more knobs by default. For example, this one has, I think, 12 different knobs, and then you can choose different presets here. Each of them having different effects on the sound. And you can see in here they've been using guitar pedals, guitar gates, there's this flux puncher, drums bus presets. Again, drums bus not being used on drums. How dare they? And then an amp simulation as well. So this is a great way just to combine effects. I love it. If you want to map additional parameters, simply click on the parameter in map mode in any of the devices in your effect rack, and then map it on any of the existing or new macros that you've got. So I can map this LFO amount for the auto filter, for example, to this one here, turn off map mode, and now I've got a new parameter, as you can see it's moving over here as well, that can be modulated. We've got a different video on audio effect racks that Luke has done. I'll leave that in the description. Briefly, I'm going to cover audio effect rack, which I don't actually have any external hardware effects to use this with. But what you want to do is, depending on your interface settings, you want to set the audio at this point in the signal chain, wherever you place this device, to go out via your audio interface or mixer to the channel where you've got the hardware effects unit. You can send the gain higher or lower depending on where you want it. You can see the peak volume here that it's sending out to, and then you can send the input on your audio interface where the effect comes back in. So you ideally want to have the effect 100% wet on your hardware device, so you can use this dry wet knob to blend the original signal before it was sent out to your hardware, and then the original back. Now, it also gives you a peak volume and a gain setting for the incoming audio, so you can kind of blend the volume of those two if there's too much difference. You can invert the phase if there's any sort of weird phase differences, and then also account for any latency that your hardware units are adding. Unfortunately, Ableton can't guess any lag that your units may have. So if you want to just kind of make sure that they're aligned in terms of timing, use this hardware latency knob. You can use it in samples or in milliseconds. So Spectrum is another utility. Again, it doesn't alter any of the audio itself. It simply analyzes or does something to the audio. So I can actually use this to see on any instrument, sound, or even my master, what is going on at any point in the spectrum. Now, I've loaded up one of my songs here as a final master so I can see the full spectrum. One of the cool things about Spectrum is you can double click on the display and it opens up a full window version, and you can resize this in Ableton really nicely. Let's play so we can start to see what's happening. Now, this particular preset that I use for Spectrum is my personal favorite set of settings. I like to leave it on the maximum block so we get this full resolution display. Lower values will kind of approximate the frequencies incoming in a more vague fashion, whereas higher blocks are more precise. And I like to get precise. I leave it on left and right because I like to see the left and right sum. Unfortunately, you can't get a left and right overlapping waveform in the Spectrum analyzer, so it just kind of sums it to mono for the purposes of analyzing. I like to leave it on the minimum refresh so it analyzes and updates faster. If you want to save a bit of CPU, you can increase this. Just know that it will look a bit laggier. And then you can also change the average, which basically it doesn't react to the audio as fast, in the sense that it kind of averages the peak volumes coming in for each of the frequencies. I like to leave it on 1 because I like to know exactly what's going on in my mix. I leave it on a line graph. Some people like the bins. I like the line. I like to have my setting on log here. I don't like the linear or the ST mode. So ST shows you the notes if you're looking at pitches for notes on a keyboard or something like that. Max actually leaves the line there at the maximum point. So this is helpful if you're wanting to see how loud your overall bass got, how loud your overall mids got, how loud a specific frequency range that you know is a problem got. And then I like to set a range around negative 80 or so to negative 6. This just allows me to see the full range of spectrum. I don't like to keep it on the auto mode because I find it gives me a headache. And I like to have a bit of buffer either side of my spectrum, just so I can kind of gauge where everything's at, right? I like to see, oh, you know, yep, the frequency's got this low, this high, and use this on anything you want to analyze the audio spectrum of. Tuner is a pretty self-explanatory device. It behaves like a traditional guitar tuner, but obviously it's an Ableton device. You can use this to choose any physical instruments that you might be playing, or you can also use it to tune any samples. So I've got a little mandolin kind of moon guitar loaded up in Spitfire Labs here. And as you can see here, when I play a C, it shows me how far off 0 cents, which is bang on pitch, so that means it's tuned correctly, it is. And in this case, I can see it's pretty close. Now, you can adjust the visuals of this tuner. For example, you can use this one, which is called the histogram view according to Ableton, which kind of allows you to see the changes over time a bit more visually, which I like. Sometimes this is simpler though to use. You can have a target or a strobe mode. The strobe mode kind of, if the line's moving down, it means it's a bit flat. If the line's moving up, it means it's a bit sharp. You can set the hertz or sense switch. So for example, if you go to hertz mode, it will show you the hertz of each of the notes rather than the sense off the original pitch it should be. And then you can set the tuning reference. So most music, it'll be 440 hertz. But if you're one of those guys who likes to make 432 hertz music or whatever, be my guest, switch this to 432. And then for the very last device, we'll finish off with one of the most helpful devices you'll come across in Ableton, the utility. I pretty much use this on every track, give or take, because it's always something I'm doing to boost the volume or to play with the stereo image or to mono the bass, as we'll all cover. So it's a very simple, small looking device, and I've just got a little vocal here loaded up as my sound example.
How could you say you didn't want me like that?
And the first thing you'll notice here on the input is that you've got this left-right phase switches. So this inverts the phase for the left and right channel. For example, if you've recorded something and it was a stereo sound and the left and right sound a bit weird, you can invert one of them or the other, or both, if you're wanting to flip the phase of the whole signal. So this is great if you've got like 2 kick drums that you're trying to layer. They don't quite sound right. Sometimes it's nice to chuck a utility on and just invert the phase of both of one of them, and then you'll see that they can sometimes layer a bit nicer. You can also change the mode from stereo to just the left channel, so now just the left channel of this vocal will come out.
How could you say you didn't want me like that?
You can do the right.
How could you say you didn't want me like that?
These are both mono because it's just taking one of the 2 signals, or you can swap the left and right around.
How could you say you didn't?
Which I don't use a lot, but sometimes it's nice to do. Now you've got this mid side knob here, which basically shows you how much of the mid or side channel you want. Now I actually have this in my defaults ticked on. If I right click, most of you will just see the width knob by default, which basically does a similar thing. When you bring the width down, it removes all of the stereo image.
How could you say you didn't want me like that?
Which is essentially the same thing as bringing the mono button on. But if you bring up the width, it basically turns up any side information to be louder.
How could you say you didn't want me like that?
As you can see, the reverb and the stereo parts of the sound are now louder. And then right click on mid side mode, bringing the mid down essentially does the same thing as bringing the width down to 0.
How could you?
But bringing the side up actually turns down the mid signal, so we're only hearing the side. This is great if you're trying to listen to the exact stereo information that's in a sample or in a sound or in an effect. Again, you got the mono button if you want to just mono it.
How could you say you didn't want?
This is different to using left or right because it actually collapses the stereo image to the center, which means you'll get any of the left or right information removed. Bass monos all the frequencies under a certain frequency. Great if you're wanting to make sure the bass of a certain sound is kept center. You can also audition to hear exactly which frequencies this is affecting. Not so great on a vocal, but would work really well on a bass. You can use the utility just to increase or decrease the gain of a certain sound. I love to use utility to do modulation or automation of certain tracks rather than on the fader volume, which I can then leave intact to mix at the end of my sessions. You can also pan things left and right. Again, sometimes it's nice to use this for modulation and stuff like that rather than the master balance or pan, because I can leave that for the mix down at the end. This also allows you to mute. If you're wanting to mute a reverb tail or something at a certain point in the track, this is great. And then this DC filter just filters out any weird sub frequencies below the human hearing that can affect the intelligibility of the audio, especially when you're compressing it or adding certain types of distortion, etc. In this case, it won't really affect it because I don't think there's many low-end frequencies in this sample. And 1 hour and 40 minutes later, that is all of Ableton's devices in one video. Now, this is a video that you can revisit at any time if you just want to recap anything or if there's something you missed the first time. But again, if you want to dive more into the world of Ableton and how you can use it to effectively make better music, more creative music, check out our Ableton Workflow Bible in the description now for free. Remember to like, subscribe for more videos like this from the EDMProd team, and I will see you in the next one.